Welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to compare and contrast the Splattershot Nova and the Splattershot Pro. Which is better? Let's find out. Alright, point number 1. The Splattershot Pro's offensive abilities. Now, as you can see, it has a somewhat decent fire rate and a somewhat decent range. Now as for the damage, we'll find out in a sec, once I start splatting people. But, as you can see, it's certainly got the range and the firepower to be a decent weapon, offensively speaking. But it's also got offensive abilities in other manners. Such as, for example, the crab tank. Very important aspect of this weapon, especially in terms of offense. It's very important because the crab tank has 2 firing modes, which is very useful offensively speaking, and if you strategize that right, you can be a very effective pro user. Now, I'm no professional Splatoon player, but this is just my personal analysis, based on past experience. Now, as for main weapon versus main weapon, it's certainly got a fighting chance against other weapons, especially the shorter range ones, like the Splashomatic or other short-range weapons. If I'm wrong about the Splashomatic being a short ranger, let me know in the comments. But as you can see, it is effective at least keeping your opponents at bay as a main weapon. Offensively speaking, it's also effective with the crab tank. But there's another way that it can be offensive, the angle shooter. Now you must be wondering how. Simple. The angle shooter allows you to actually point out the individuals. You essentially hit them with it, and it allows you to sort of know where they are, if my memory serves. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about that, but that's a very important thing to note. The moral of this point is that this is an offensive weapon. Its capabilities are pretty obvious when you think about the crab tank and the angle shooter, as well as the range and the firepower. Now, as far as the damage, that, even if it is bad, which we will look into that later in the video, can be made up for with the fire rate and, of course, the range. And let's not forget the trusty crab tank. Which brings me to my next point. The Pro's defensive abilities. Now, those same offensive abilities can also be translated to defense, because the range would allow you to keep your opponents at bay until you can get a crab tank, which can keep them further at bay, because the crab tank is both an offensive and defensive special, and can be utilized properly in both manners, if you know what you're doing, as you can see here. I'm trying to keep the opponents at bay here with the crab tank, while moving in closer to get them with the main weapon, which is a good strategy for this one. It's very effective, you just need to know what you're doing. Now again, I'm no pro Splatoon player, but I think I know what I'm doing with the crab tank, at least to a certain extent. But enough about my skill set. Back to the defensive capabilities. This weapon is very formidable in terms of offense and defense when you pair good strategy with, of course, the crab tank. But, in my opinion, it's more suited for defense than it is offense, because you can keep your opponents at bay with the range, the firepower, and of course, the trusty crab tank. So in my opinion, the Splattershot Pro is a more defensive than offensive weapon. What's your opinion? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your input. That's just my personal opinion. Which brings me to my last point about the Splattershot Pro. Its maneuverability. Now, the maneuverability on this weapon isn't entirely the best, but it's not entirely the worst either. It can be considered a part of both categories. Somewhere in between, in other words. What do you think of its maneuverability? Is it good or is it bad? Personally, I think it's neither here nor there. Kind of good, kind of bad. But that's just my opinion. What's your opinion of the Splattershot Pro? Let me know in the comments. I'd really appreciate your input. It's very important to me. So let me know your opinions of the Pro and all these points I've mentioned in the comments below. On to the next one. The Splattershot Nova. An interesting weapon in its own right. Which brings me to my next point. The Splattershot Nova's offensive abilities. Now, this weapon is somewhat similar to other Splattershots, like the conventional Splattershot and of course the Tentatek. However, its kit is a bit more defensive, but we'll get to that in the next point. For now, we're going to focus on the offensive abilities, which in this weapon are confined to the main weapon itself. Now, you don't need to worry too much, because you can actually get in closer, which you need to make up for this weapon's issues with the damage. So you can actually take people out a lot easier than you would if you tried to stay at a distance, which I wouldn't advise because this weapon isn't farthest reaching anyway. So to be the best offensive player with this, you need to learn to get in a little closer. So you can take your opponents out with this weapon's fire rate more efficiently. But that's just my opinion. Now, this brings me to my next point. The Nova's defense. Now, as I was saying, this weapon's kit is a little more defensive. The point sensor sub, and of course the Killer Whale 5.0 special are a more defensive type of kit for this weapon, which can be very useful in helping you get closer so you can splat your opponents. How do you do that? Simple. Hit them with the point sensor, and then unleash the Killer Whale 5.1 so you can actually keep them at bay while you sneak in and get them. For example, that's just one way you can use this kit to actually help you out a little. In rank mode, you can use it to help out yourself, or you can use this method to help your teammates get in closer, while you fill up your gouge and get more killer whales. And you can do that, because this weapon, while having a defensive kit, is actually a lot more strategic of a weapon than the Pro. So I would recommend playing this weapon in a more strategic manner than a defensive manner, because this weapon is a slight better of a mix of offense and defense than the Pro, as its defensive kit and offensive abilities seem to suggest. But that's just my opinion. This is a very efficient strategic weapon, because the fire rate can be very effective when you use the kit of the point sensor and the Killer Whale 5.1. Let me know if I'm wrong on the point sensor part. To actually sneak up and get them, using the point sensor to point them out, and of course the Killer Whale 5.1 to make your life easier in sneaking up on them because they're too distracted by the special, which would track them down, as you're aware, because you saw it earlier in the video. Now, this allows you to actually get a little bit more of an advantage against them, so this weapon can be used strategically in the right hands. Which brings me to my next point, maneuverability. The Nova's maneuverability is better than the Splattershot Pro, but it's also not the best either. which is where the Killer Whale 5.1 comes in handy. It allows you to maneuver a little bit more because it keeps your weapon from being taken advantage of. Because like I said, it's not the most maneuverable, but it's not the worst either. It's certainly better than the Pro in terms of maneuverability. The Killer Whale 5.1 certainly helps it out there. Now, if the Killer Whale 5.1 were on the Pro would be a better weapon in this department. Because the range, and of course the fire rate on the Pro, can be used a little more efficiently if it had a special like the Killer Whale. But, as we covered already, it has the Crab Tank, but enough about the Pro. This weapon is very efficient in strategy and defense, but it's a more strategic one. What do you think? Do you like the Nova? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your input. But that's just me. Do you like the Nova? Or do you like the Pro? Before you make your decision and let me know in the comments, let's talk about the stats. Because we're going to do that right now. The stats of these weapons are very interesting. Now, as you can see here, Splattershot Pro's stats are as follows. A decent range, a decent damage, but just an okay fire rate, which is an interesting stat output for this weapon. Now, as far as the stat output for the Nova, the range is decent and the fire rate's decent, but the Nova's damage is, well, bad, as you can see here. When compared to the Pro, the Nova's range and fire rate are actually the two that are more advantageous. However, it would seem that the Pro has a slightly better range than the Nova, while the Nova has a much better fire rate. However, when compared to the Pro, the Nova's damage is pretty bad, because the Pro has a much better damage. But again, I'm going to say it, the Pro's kit is more defensive, while the Nova's kit allows it to be more strategic. Because if you use the Killer Whale 5.1 in the point sensor, you can use the Nova more strategically, making the Nova a more strategic weapon. But if you use the Splattershot Pro and its special sub-combo, the Angle Shooter and Crab Tank, which is a more defensive spread, then you get a more defensive weapon in the Splattershot Pro. However, if you look at the stats, both weapons seem to be somewhat decent offensively. But the Splattershot Pro is actually a better offensive weapon, strategically speaking, because if you look at its stats, its range and damage are much better, while its fire rate is just okay. Whereas the Nova has a good fire rate and a good range, but its damage is not very good, forcing you to be more strategic with the Nova than you would have to be with the Pro. Now, remember, I am not a professional Splatoon player. I'm just a guy that plays casual. These are all just my opinions. Now, let me know your opinions in the comments below. Do you like the defensive Pro? Or do you like the strategic Nova? Let me know your opinions in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one.